Well, if you have a Bible, you can turn to the book of Ephesians, chapter 6. And as you're turning there was an event that occurred a number of years ago that still is fresh in my mind, and it ties in with what we're looking at tonight. When I was in college, one of my college friends was a Chinese student, and he had a Chinese name, but when he moved to America, he knew he needed to adopt a name that people could pronounce better, so he went with the name Roderick. And Roderick and I were friends from our freshman year, different things, and throughout college. But one thing was fun was when it was time to graduate, Roderick was the commencement speaker at our graduation time, or the student speaker. They had someone else come in to give the official address. But I tell you, of all the different students I've heard speaking at a commencement type of ceremony, he probably did the best job. I mean, he was great. He was hilarious. He was sharing about some of his college experiences, but he kept the whole audience laughing as he was telling about how different things were going to an American college versus how things were in China. And there were all these different things that he brought up, and I put a smile on people's faces. But then he did something that nobody was expecting. He's facing the whole crowd of all the parents and friends of the graduates. It was a packed area, lots and lots of people. And then he faces a particular section of the crowd, and he starts speaking in Mandarin. And of course, nobody in the audience, being Chinese for the most part, could understand what he was saying, or at least most of the audience couldn't. But as we looked, we saw that he was speaking to his parents who had flown over from China. And at the end, he bows before his parents and honors them for sending him to college and giving him that opportunity. It was one of those things where you realize that's countercultural. That doesn't usually happen in an American setting. Now, here's the interesting thing. My friend at the time was not even a Christian. But there was a godly principle that operated in the culture that he came from in terms of honoring your parents that was so powerful and so much like what we find in the scriptures, it left the whole audience in silence. Everyone kind of took in that moment of someone that not only did well academically, not only was honored among other students, but then took time to acknowledge the ones that brought him there. Pretty powerful. If you want to learn about a culture of honor, also talk to Joyce. She worked in Japan for a number of years where honor is such a key element in the culture, particularly honor of children to parents, but other types of honor too. So we've been in a series looking at the supernatural. And tonight, we're going to be looking at supernatural honor. And you might be thinking, well, wait a minute. If we're looking at the supernatural, if we look at a topic like angels or other things, it's obvious, right? Angels are supernatural beings. Of course it's supernatural, but how can honor be a supernatural topic? Well, as it turns out, the Bible expresses it very clearly. So if you have a Bible, turn to Ephesians 6, and we're going to be starting in verse 2. We're going to be looking at several scriptures tonight. And this is one that many of us are familiar with. But it says this: honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. You see, honor isn't just something that people do for fun. Now, some people might act like they honor someone, but they're not doing it from inside. But when there's a genuine honor, you find it's more than just what people say. It's more than what people do. It actually comes out of the heart. And here's one of the first scriptures we're looking at where there's an honor that comes from the heart, and if you live it out, there's not only the knowledge that, oh, I'm doing God's will. He actually promises a blessing. Honor your father and mother that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. So in terms of honoring people, the first category we're going to be looking at is honoring family. Okay? So, there are many, many scriptures we could look at with lots of examples of honor. But we know many of these stories. But I think as we draw out key points tonight that illustrate the importance of honor and what God releases through honor when people operate in that way, we may begin to think differently about who we honor in our lives. In the book of Genesis, chapter 43 and 44, many of us are familiar with the story of Joseph as he's down in Egypt and he's separated from his brothers. And over the course of the story, something interesting happens. We have some generational tension going on. You see, Joseph's brothers come down to Egypt because there's a famine in the land. They don't know Joseph is alive. Many of you, again, know the story. But when Joseph is there, he doesn't reveal himself to them, but he says, "Bring your youngest brother, otherwise you will see my face no more." And in the meantime, he takes one of his brothers, Simeon, captive, and he says, "Unless you bring your youngest brother to me, you're not going to get any more food." And when you've got a famine, that's a problem. So here's where things get interesting. The brothers go back to their father Jacob, and they say, "Look, this is what the ruler of Egypt says. Let us bring Benjamin, our youngest brother. Let us bring him down so that we can receive food, that we can live." And their father says no. He says, "Look, you know my wife bore me 2 sons. One of them, Joseph, he thinks is dead. The other one, he said, if he's going to go down, he's going to die." He says, "All these things are against me. I'm not going to allow you to take my son, Benjamin." Isn't it interesting sometimes how circumstances can change our opinions? We can have a very resolute stance. But after a while, they eat up all the grain that was brought from Egypt. They're looking around at each other. There's no more food. There's no more sustenance. And Jacob finally says to his sons, "Okay, go back down to Egypt." They say, "Unless we bring Benjamin, we're not going. The guy said we can't do it." And here's the interesting thing. Even though Jacob initially refuses, it's when his son Judah stands up that his mind changes. And Judah says this. He says, "Look, Dad, we've got to go down to live. In fact, if you would have released Benjamin earlier, we could have already been back again." But he says, "I'll be surety for the lad." That's almost like King James English. He's saying, "I'm going to be responsible. I'm going to take full ownership, Dad. If anything happens to my brother Benjamin, you require it at my hands. In fact, I will bear the guilt before you for the rest of my life." He's honoring his father. He's saying, "Father, no matter what, you can trust me. I know your heart is in this. I know, Father, you want your legacy to come through this. I'm going to carry the responsibility of stewarding your dream." Have any of us ever honored our parents to that extent, where we're putting down our lives and saying, "I'm willing to give up everything to let your dream come to pass"? You might say, "Well, those were some nice words." Well, actually, when the brothers go down to Egypt, that very promise is tested. In fact, when Joseph, through some clever means, decides that Benjamin needs to be taken and says, okay, you guys, he puts this cup in Benjamin's sack and says, look, you stole it. Benjamin's going to be my slave and the rest of you can go free. He's testing the hearts of his brothers that years ago had sold him into slavery. And who is it but Judah that stands up and goes before Joseph and says, sir, you're the ruler of all of Egypt. But in so many words, he says, I made a promise to my dad. I've promised my father that this brother is going to go back up to him. If he doesn't come back, my father's going to die. He said, so instead, let me be your slave and let my brother go free. And that's when Joseph can't contain himself anymore. He tells all the servants to leave. He cries out and shares who he really is with his brothers. It's a cool story for a lot of reasons. But when we see the power of honoring a father, you recognize, wow, Judah understood something. Judah got something in there. He didn't prioritize himself. He didn't prioritize his own needs. I mean, Judah at this point had a family of his own, but he laid down everything to honor his father. And at the end, when Jacob is ready to die years later, and he's blessing each of his children, other than Joseph, guess who gets the best blessing? It's Judah. Some sons get like a 5-word blessing, okay, yep, this and this, this and this. But when it comes to Judah, I mean, Jacob is just pouring out blessing after blessing after blessing on the son that honored the father. May our understanding of honor be expanded tonight. If we had had a survey at the beginning, how many of you feel like you honor people in your lives? How many of you feel like you do a good job in that? I bet we would have had a lot of amens. I like honor. I'm good at honor. Yeah. But when we hold it up to some of the standards that we see in the Word of God, suddenly we realize, whoa, maybe there's a deeper level of honor that God wants me to walk in. By the way, as we look at just some of these different Bible stories, some of them we're going to be turning to and looking in detail, some of them we'll be skimming over, but we'll see the contrast and the different result between honor and dishonor. And to reference another story out of Genesis that many of us know, after the flood, Noah comes out with his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and we know one of his sons sees his nakedness after Noah's drunk, after he's uncovered in his bed. One of his sons goes looking at him, laughs at him, dishonors his father. Then the other 2 sons, we know the story. They go in backwards and they grab a sheet between the 2 of them and they cover the nakedness of their father Noah. They both get a blessing. But what happens to Ham and his son Canaan? Noah says, cursed be Canaan. There's a curse that ends up over a whole family tree because of dishonor. This is so real. I hope we capture this tonight, that these are more than just fun Sunday school stories. There are principles and there are ways of God that if you're looking for a blessing in your life, if you're looking for God to raise you up, if you're looking for a breakthrough that can only come from the Lord, start asking yourself, God, am I walking in your culture of supernatural honor? Because there's natural honor and there's supernatural honor. There's a kind of honor that people can do maybe to act a certain way. There's a certain honor that we might see when people say, okay, I guess I can honor you a little bit here and there. but there's an honor that comes from the heart that transforms situations, and we'll be looking at more of those examples. Let's turn to Matthew chapter 10. We'll expand our understanding of honor tonight, Lord willing. So Matthew chapter 10. And here we're going to find out that there are different forms of honor. Now, if someone really dug deep in the Bible, we could probably break down all kinds of different types of honor that are outlined. We're going to be looking at 3 main ones tonight and then a 4th separately. But the first one was family. Now let's look at the second. Matthew chapter 10, and we'll start in verse 40. This is Jesus speaking. He who receives you receives me, and he who receives me receives him who sent me. Ah, that's already deep. Now we're getting somewhere, because Jesus is saying, look, if you receive me, you're not just receiving me, you're actually receiving the Father, because I'm not doing my own thing. I'm representing my Father. And furthermore, he who receives you, believer, they're not just receiving you, they're actually receiving me because I sent you. Verse 41, he who receives a prophet in the name of a prophet shall receive a prophet's reward. And he who receives a righteous man in the name of a righteous man receives a righteous man's reward. And whoever gives one of these little ones only a cup of cold water in my name, or in the name of a disciple, assuredly I say to you, he shall by no means lose his reward. What's Jesus saying here? I mean, we know throughout Scripture it's important to do good things, but he's going deeper. He's not just saying, oh, I'm telling you, do this good thing, do these good acts. He's actually saying, depending on how you honor, reflects what you receive. I'll say that again. Depending on how you honor, reflects what you receive. So if you can't honor a person based on who God has made them to be, you might not receive what God is trying to release through that individual. For example, it says if you receive a prophet in the name of a prophet, you receive a prophet's reward. But what happens if a prophet comes by and you say, nah, I don't think you're the real deal, or I don't believe in prophets, or I don't whatever? You're going to miss the very reward and blessing that God has for you. But this requires something. It requires us to see things not through our earthly eyes, but to see things from God's perspective. So if the first category of honor was family, the second category I'd like to suggest is positional honor. You can honor someone for their position. Probably the best example of this in the Bible, or one of the clearest, is in the life of David. David is so good at honoring people based on their position. It's amazing. In fact, even when King Saul is hunting David unrighteously, and David, we know, was anointed of God. God had purposes for him to become the king, and he's given the opportunity for this wicked man Saul, who's hunting him, this unrighteous king who's forsaken God. David's given the opportunity to get even and to put him to death. And one of David's servants actually says, hey, I can take Saul's life right now. David says, no, I'm not going to stretch out my hand against the Lord's anointed. For the note takers, you'll find that in 1 Samuel chapter 24. But there's something that David understood. There's something that he grasped. Because it's so easy when we're around people to take things personally, to think, you did me wrong. I don't need to listen to you. You did what was not right in God's sight. And you know what? Technically, that's true. Saul did do the wrong thing. He was pursuing a righteous man and treating him like a criminal. And David, for years, is fleeing for his life, away from his family, away from his home, hiding in caves because of the unrighteousness of the man pursuing him. Wouldn't it be easy to get even or try to get even in a situation like that? But David honors the position not because of Saul, but because he fears God. And he recognizes God put this man in this position. He might be messing it up. He might not be a good person, but there's something about God in him just based on the position. And if I stretch out my hand against the Lord's anointed, God isn't going to hold me guiltless. So he refrains. And once again, because of that righteous act of honor, there's a blessing. And actually at the end of that passage in 1 Samuel 24, Saul is convicted in his heart, and he cries out and says, David, my son, you've been more righteous than I have been, and now I know for sure that you will be king of Israel. Wow. Maybe someone in here has felt like they're not getting acknowledged in the way that they want to be. Maybe you feel like, why is it that other people around me are promoted? Why is it that other people seem to be called out and acknowledged? Why am I not being called out in that kind of way? Could it be that the key to your promotion, the key to breakthrough for you, could come by honoring what God has put in others? Something to think about. Now, just for the sake of contrast, what happens when you dishonor the position that God has put over someone? An easy example, but also a harsh example, is in the life of Elisha. You remember when the youths come out to meet Elisha, 42 of them, and they're calling out after him, and he's the prophet in Israel, and they're calling up, go up, you bald head, go up, you bald head. And he took it personally, and he turns to them and he curses them in the name of the Lord. And two she-bears, two female bears come out and maul 42 of the youths. Wow. That's one of those intense stories that sometimes get skipped in the younger, Sunday school echelons. Now, I'm not going to say whether that was right or not on Elisha's part, but there is a principle that we're in a pattern that we're starting to see. When you're dishonoring the authority that God wants you to honor, there are serious consequences. Serious consequences. And many times, in looking back at Old Testament examples, Paul in the New Testament says, these things were written for our admonition. Meaning, it's not just a fun story, folks. There's a principle that God's wanting to teach us. Sometimes people say, I'm dealing with these limitations. I'm dealing with all these hardships in my life. I must have been cursed. There must be some witchcraft in my family line. Someone must have been, messing with a Ouija board or whatever else. Pick your poison. Somebody's coming against me. Why are things not working? It's possible. Those things can happen. But could it be that some of the limitations, some of the issues in our life could be coming from a curse that the enemy didn't put on us, but it could be coming from a curse that comes out of dishonoring what God put before us, and we didn't acknowledge it His way? Just something to think about. All right, for this one, let's turn together to the book of Exodus, chapter 18. You guys still here? All right. Exodus 18. We're going to be looking at a third example of honor. We've looked at the context of family. We've looked at position. But now we're going to be going into another facet. So Exodus 18, remember, this is after Moses had led the children of Israel out of Egypt. They're no longer slaves. All the miracles, all the powerful signs and wonders God did through him, everything happened up until this point where suddenly Moses is leading about 2 million people. I mean, amazing man of God. He hears God's voice, walking in God's power. And what happens? He runs into his father-in-law. Let's start in verse 6. His father-in-law's name is Jethro. Now he had said to Moses, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons with her. Verse 7. So Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, bowed down, and kissed him. What? Can that really be in the Bible? Surely not. I mean, this is Moses. I mean, everybody's bowing before him. And later we see when people try to stand up against them, God's fire falls down or the earth opens up and people fall in. I mean, this is Moses. He walked with God. And yet when his father-in-law comes out, he's bowing down, kissing him, honoring him. But that's not where it ends. After they see how they're doing and connect, and he gets to share testimonies, and they find out after each other's welfare, they're asking each other, seeing how they're doing, then look what happens the next day. Verse 13. And so it was on the next day that Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood before Moses from morning until evening. So when Moses' father-in-law saw all that he did for the people, he said, what is this thing that you're doing to the people? Why do you alone sit and all the people stand before you from morning until evening? And Moses said to his father-in-law, because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a difficulty, they come to me, and I judge between one and another, and I make known the statutes of God and his laws. Are you catching it? This is how in tune Moses was with God's voice. Literally any person that was dealing with a hard situation out of the 2 million in Israel could come to Moses, and Moses could listen, hear exactly from God what they needed, and speak God's word to that situation. Wow. I mean, I think most fathers-in-law at that point would say, man, you've got something going. This is amazing. This is impressive. Look what Jethro says. Verse 17. So Moses' father-in-law said to him, the thing that you do is not good. You're leading 2 million people through the desert. God's signs and wonders are following you everywhere. You're so anointed, you're hearing God's word, you know you're called, God has spoken to you, these are my people, you're to shepherd them. And this guy Jethro comes up and says, what you're doing isn't good. How many of us in that situation would say, thanks Jethro, that's real cool. You're the high priest in Midian, you do your own thing, but we're following God. I'm hearing from him directly. I know what I'm doing. That's not what Moses did. In fact, he follows the advice that his father-in-law gives him. Jethro basically says, you're going to wear yourself out, appoint certain leaders over this business so that they can share the load with you, so you don't have to do it alone. And Moses obeys the words of his father-in-law. Why would he do that? Why would Moses, this mighty prophet of God, where they said in the Old Testament, no one else arose like Moses, who would speak with God face to face, why would he do what this man is telling him to do? They had a history. You see, it wasn't just that there was a family connection, even though that was there too. But back when Moses had nothing, when he fled from Egypt with nothing, he fled for his life. Remember, Pharaoh was pursuing him when he was 40 years old? He had absolutely nothing in the world. And who took him in? Jethro. His father-in-law, before he was even his father-in-law, let Moses dwell with him. He let him shepherd his flock. He eventually gives him his daughter Zipporah. He does all these things. He sets him up. He trains him. And for 40 years, Moses is working for him. We've got to catch this tonight, guys. Don't forget your roots. Don't forget what people have done for you. There's not just family honor, and there's not just positional honor. In God's kingdom, there's honoring legacy. When there's a legacy that God has established in something, it's so important not to disregard it. And we see this scripturally over and over and over again, where God is calling on old covenants, where God is going back to previous promises to other generations, or God is bringing blessings on families or situations based on what people did a long time ago. And if God operates that way, we need to do that too. If Moses, this mighty, mighty man, is willing to say, I'm going to humble myself and I'm going to honor this man because of the legacy that he's had in my life, what excuse do we have for forgetting those who helped us get to where we are now? What excuse do we have? It might be that God's calling you on. It might be that God's promoting you to new places or having you move to a new setting, but never stop honoring those who God used to help raise you up. Because in His kingdom, that is so critical. In fact, if you go the other way, there are lots of problems that come because God honors the foundation and the legacy that He lays through people. It might seem weird, the idea of even honoring by bowing down. It might seem like, what kind of a cultural thing is that? This is kind of an aside. This was several years ago. God was in a season of really emphasizing that He's my Father and that He loves me, and I thought, oh, this is great. And then one day as I was praying, I suddenly felt like I needed to get on my knees and pray to God that way. And then I just got on my face, and I paused, and I said, well, wait a minute. You're my Father. Why am I bowing down on my face? This isn't right. And God spoke in that moment. He said, yes, it is. He said, in your culture, Max, you're not used to honoring a father that way. He said, but I'm your Father, and I receive honor in a different way than what you're used to in honoring a father. I thought, wow. You don't see too many children getting down on their face, honoring their fathers. And I'm not saying that you have to start doing that outward act right now, but hopefully it reflects something on the inside where there's a recognition, wow, God, I come from this person. God, these people, this mother-father thing, they sacrificed for me. Or maybe it's, God, I had no hope in the world, and then this person raised me up. This Christian friend came, and when I was in my lowest pit, they pulled me out. I'm not in that pit anymore. It's easy to forget about them. but do we honor the legacy of what God has done through other people? Maybe it's someone who trained you in everything that you know how to do today. Maybe when you look back, you think, how did I get to where I got? And you think back and you think, if it wasn't for that person, or if it wasn't for those people, I could never have gotten here. Maybe it was a teacher you had once. Maybe it was a boss that just gave you so much favor and said, you know what? No one else wants to hire you, but come along, I'll train you, and I'll let you become proficient in this until you're good enough to do it on your own. Honor the legacy that God has put in your life. It's so important. Don't miss it. Don't miss it. The opposite is true in the Bible again, and we don't have to turn there now, but in the book of Judges, we know that Gideon was one of the judges that saved Israel, okay? But after he dies, the Israelites forget all about him. In fact, the people of Shechem kill all of his sons because one of his sons, Abimelech, who was the son of a harlot, he says, hey, do you want all of Gideon's sons to rule over you, or do you just want one son to rule over you? They're like, no brainer, way easier to follow one guy. So they kill all the other sons, all of his half-brothers. But by doing that, they totally forgot that none of them would even be alive if it wasn't for Gideon. If it wasn't for Gideon's deliverance, Israel was so impoverished, Israel was getting so destroyed. It was Gideon who rescued them. So even after he was gone, there was a legacy of life that he left behind. Who are the people that brought you to where you are? In the case of Shechem and Abimelech, a curse came on them. And both Shechem, or the Shechemites, however you want to say it, and Abimelech, they all perished. They were all destroyed because they disregarded the legacy that God had put before them. You guys can probably see the pattern by now, right? When you honor, there's blessing. When you dishonor, there's a curse. We see that again and again and again. And we already touched on where real honor comes from is the heart. Because you can say nice things about people. You can say, oh yeah, thanks for your help. This was so great. Or maybe even give a little speech one time and honor a person. Say, hey, this person was so great in my life. Yay, yay, yay. And then you feel like you've really honored them. But true honor comes from the heart. And you don't forget what they've done. Let's just ask a simple question, because this might sound like an obvious thing if we're saying this is what the Bible's saying, this is what the good thing is. What if someone's just thinking, what if I don't like honoring? I like to honor myself. Why would I honor somebody else? If that's something that you're wondering, there are several things we could say about that, but one is in Proverbs 18:12 it says this: before destruction, the heart of a man is haughty, and before honor is humility. So we see in Solomon's wisdom here, he's making a contrast. If you want to be destroyed, be haughty. And if you want to come into honor, be humble. In other words, if you feel like you can't honor other people, there's some kind of a pride issue going on. There's got to be a root of pride in there somewhere. Because if you've got a humility in your heart that says, other people have made me, other people have helped me, I wouldn't be here without others, then you can acknowledge that easily, and it's not a problem. But if you can't honor people, scripturally now, this is going to sound harsh, but just based on the scriptures we've looked at, if you can't honor people, destruction is waiting. example after example after example in the scriptures. If you can't honor people, destruction is waiting. This is such a key issue for God. So what should I do? If you're finding yourself in this situation, you're thinking, boy, I don't like the sound of that. What should I do? Ask God to put humility in your heart. Humble yourself before God and say, God, deliver me from pride. Deliver me from anything that would rise up in me that says, oh, I don't want to honor that person. I want the credit. I want whatever. If there's something like that that comes up, just say, God, please forgive me. I humble myself. Set me free of whatever that is. Okay. We don't want it to get too heavy in here. But I did want to emphasize the weightiness of it. So, we've been looking at examples of honoring people. And what I said at the beginning, if you remember, I said we're going to be looking at 3 examples of honor, and then we're going to look at a 4th. The 3 examples we looked at were, how do you honor people with family, with position, with legacy? But when you think about it, who is honor really for? Really, at the core, the ability in us to honor is really supposed to be directed at God, primarily. I mean, God is so amazing. We're His creation. I mean, we talked about family, but think about the very one that made you. It's God. So how do we approach God in that? Now, let me pause us before we go any further. Because if I say something like, oh, we need to honor God, there's something on the inside that says, oh, good, okay, yep, I do that. I go to church, I read my Bible, I pray, I do whatever, and we think, I honor God. Or maybe I'm in ministry, or I do whatever, I honor God. I'm okay. Whew. Don't have to worry. Check mark on that. But do we really honor God? I mean, from the heart. When you meet with God, what does it look like? Here's a fun litmus test, and this is one that Fred Herzog has shared in so many words in the past, but if someone came to meet you, how would you interact with another person? Let's say the President of the United States was coming to your home. How would you prepare? How would you dress? How would you talk to him? How would you prepare your family? What about a king? Oh boy, you're in a foreign country and the king is over everything and life and death is in the power of the king's hand and you're going to be presented before the king. How are you going to act? Going to walk up to the king, hey king, what's up? How's it going? Or are you going to approach him very respectfully knowing, if I disrespect this guy, I might not live. What about a person you look up to, a role model or a celebrity or some person where you think, oh, if I could meet one person in my lifetime, it would be so-and-so. If someone opened up the opportunity for you to meet them, how would you act? How would you interact with them? How would you treat them? I'm asking all of that because God is so much more than any one of those people. And yet sometimes we get so used to having God around us that we forget to honor Him in that way. I mean, for example, we talked about, imagine if the president was coming to your home, how would you prepare your family? And I think everybody here would somehow prepare their family and themselves, and you'd probably, wipe every little spot off your mirror and make sure, it's best clothes and all this stuff. But do we prepare our households the same way to interact with God? Do we recognize that, wow, this is the King of the universe. This is the one who's created everything, and He's coming to my home. I need to prepare myself. I need to prepare my family. We need to get ready because we honor the God who created us. What does honor look like? You know, we often talk from the front here about the persecuted church in different parts of the world. And one very recent story I just came across came from the nation of Vietnam, which, as many of you know, is a communist nation right now. But there are two people in Vietnam, a wife named Gia and her husband Dai. And they had an interesting situation that they came across. Remember, we're talking about honoring God now. In a communist country, there are difficulties that you face that you might not see in the United States. But the situation that Gia and Dai found themselves in is they have a daughter named Ruth who has a specific medical condition that's been causing some developmental difficulties, okay? But there's special treatment that country offers for that condition. They have different funds and things that you can get access to when you apply for it. So they applied for the funds, and they went to a government office, and this was not that long ago, and they waited all day long, and waiting and waiting and waiting, and finally the government officials came to them and said, "You have a choice." They said, "Change the name of your daughter so that it's no longer a Christian name." Their daughter's name's Ruth. They said, "Change her name and renounce your faith. Stop walking with Jesus, and we will give you the funds that are needed and the medical help that are needed to help her development. And if you don't, you will not be receiving from this government program." We hear about different kinds of persecution. Sometimes we hear about people dying for their faith. Sometimes we hear about people being tortured. But when I read about this recently, and this came across, or this was published very recently, so it's within the last few months, we don't always think about what costs are involved in following God in other parts of the world, and what that means to a family and to parents when you have to choose between honoring God and very practical, very real issues in your life. And for the two of them, they decided to say, nope, we're not going to receive the money, we're not going to receive the thing, we're following God all the way, and her name is Ruth. Do we really honor God? Do we really prioritize Him like that when the needs are so intense, when the alternatives seem so appealing and so necessary almost? Do we really honor God? I mean, if someone was following you around and watched how you spend your days, watch how you live your life, how you interact with other people, when they look at your life, would they be able to testify and say, yes, this person really honors God? Or would they say, yeah, I mean, I think they're a Christian. They mention God sometimes. They pray occasionally. How important is honoring God to us? How much are we really concerned with it? You guys, honoring God is a necessity. And with our lives, there are so many different things that are important. And by the way, this is not a sermon about tithing, so you can relax. But one way where it's obvious if we honor God or not is our finances. How people or where people spend their money just in life in general is an indication of what's important to them. Okay? Another area is your time. If you never take time for God, do you really honor Him? Or do you just think that you honor Him? What about dreams? things that you're looking forward to, your goals, your ambitions in life, do they feature God, or are they mostly just dreams about you and how to make yourself comfortable or how to make your home nicer? How important is honoring God to you? What about priorities? And I'm not against having a nice home. I'm not against having a good family. These are good things from God, but how important is it compared to honoring God in your life? So the worship team can come on up. But there's another form of honor that goes so deep, and we can miss it if we don't catch it in the scriptures. And it says this. Actually, I'll read it out. You can turn there if you'd like, but it's out of Romans chapter 12, and this is kind of our concluding thought for the night. But if you're saying, God, what's the highest form of honor? What's the deepest way that I can totally honor you? Paul breaks it down. He says, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. If you're a living sacrifice, you're no longer living for yourself. You might be alive, but the whole purpose of a sacrifice is for somebody else. And if you're a living sacrifice for Jesus Christ, your life is no longer live for yourself. Your priorities no longer center on yourself. Ask yourselves tonight, God, how can I honor you more? Let's pray.